The Baltic States, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Often lumped together and surrounded by giants, these states can seem smaller than they really are, made to be peripheral and secondary extensions of various larger powers that govern them, usually Russia. But when we look deeper at their history, what we realize is that this couldn't be further from the truth. This region is far more than peripheral. Indeed, the old inhabitants of these lands were unique, separate, and inhabited a vast area. The trials of history have forced these nations into the orbit of larger powers, but their people, culture, and history are as unique as any of the other major European powers.
Hi everyone, this is Travels with an Archaeologist. I'm the Archaeologist, now let's get into the travels.
Today, I'm going to look at a little explored field of archaeology, the prehistoric Baltics, which in this region can extend into the Middle Ages. Also, sorry for the late release of this video. As I've said before, I do this in my free time and I'm on my own here. I don't use AI except for the occasional thumbnail, so videos sadly can't really be as frequent as I'd like. When I get busy, videos fall behind, and I have been very busy lately. But I will keep pumping them out if I know I'm making content people like, so please do remember to like and subscribe, as I have no way of knowing how popular my videos are if you don't do either one. So let's start, of course, at the very beginning of habitation in the Baltics. And for this, we are going to start with two sites, one in Estonia and one in Lithuania. Now, if you're willing to take a bus roughly an hour and a half east of Tallinn, outside a village of 42 people, and walk a further 15 minutes, you can get to this site of Hundikangrud. No? Is it just me who does stuff like that on the fly? I maintain that I am not the weird one, but this site was an important one to visit. Hundikangrud in Estonia is one of the most impressive Iron Age burials in the Baltics, and it's one of the oldest at 1100 to 200 BCE. Radiocarbon dating hasn't been done on many graves in Hundikangrud, but from the ones that have been dated in recent research, it seems the graves were constructed at the earlier end of this estimation, dating before 800 BCE. There were indeed multiple people buried in these graves, and from what I can tell, they think that it was mostly for elite families. Now, why do they think that when these graves are relatively bare with very few goods? Well, I haven't had a chance to research that yet, so for now I'll take their word for it, and my future self will get back to you with their reasoning once he's looked up the academic work. As it turns out, there's not a lot of conclusions that can be made from this society based on their graves alone, because, academically speaking, their graves are all over the place. Excavators have only gotten around 20 graves, but what it shows is that they don't seem to contain any pattern of individuals. Both men and women are interred, and in some cases there are multiple individuals to a grave. There doesn't seem to be a pattern on whether they were inhumations or cremations either. However, all individuals within a burial mound date to the same time period, and children and the elderly tend to be placed outside. The graves nevertheless fall into two groups, ones built in limestone heaps and others built of granite. These granite ones seem to contain far more artifacts and fewer individuals. However, at least one grave contains a lot of iron artifacts that date to after the burial took place, suggesting that maybe it had multiple uses after all. But what makes Hundikangrud special is firstly its age. Graves here date from the early Iron Age, and some of them probably even to the late Bronze Age, which is a rarity in Baltic funerary archaeology, but also that it is right near a region where people lived, which can give us a more holistic view of their society. Now, when people first came to the Baltics after the retreat of the glaciers, they actually came to this site here, which is the hill fort in Muuksi. Now, this hill fort was built around the Bronze Age, which in this era extends to about 1800 BCE. But in fact, the region has been inhabited since pretty much the retreat of the glaciers. We have evidence here of people since the Mesolithic. Hill forts are generally some of the most important prehistoric features in Europe, especially here in the Baltics. And in Estonia, this hill fort is very close to the massive burial, suggesting that it once had great importance. And while it's quite a sight to visit once you're there, it's too big to be captured by my equipment. Fortunately, because hill forts were fairly common, we do have a clearer example in our second site in Lithuania. There are 5 surviving hill forts at Kernavė in Lithuania, all of which date to different time periods. Kernavė is an interesting site because it's been inhabited since the Paleolithic, when humans first entered the region, and it was inhabited right down until the 14th century, and still does have an inhabited population today. And you can see from these Lithuanian hill forts, which are a bit more modern than the Estonian one, by the way, that the sides of these hills are not natural. The tops have been flattened, and on the top were built palisades over the village below, all to keep it defended from outside invaders. Meanwhile, the hills were straightened so that invaders didn't have an easy way up. These are by far some of the most common prehistoric living spaces in Europe, and it's easy to see why. In Kernavė, we see the hill forts defending the settlement between the river and the hillside. In Estonia, we see the hill is the defensive fort, and of course this is to be expected. Estonia's hill fort is much larger. The people here were the region's first agriculturalists, with some studies suggesting they grew cannabis. But this has not been corroborated and is probably just a rumor within the circle of this study. But to understand the lifestyles of these people, we need to look beyond what pops up in an excavation.
Now, when you're studying archaeology, especially prehistoric archaeology, it is just as, if not more important, to take note of the natural landscape around you, because not only will that tell you why people settled here, it'll also show you how the landscape has changed and shifted over millennia. Now, here in Kernavė, the reason they settled here was this river, the river Neris, which is considered the main river of Lithuania.
And in the case of both these sites, we can use the natural landscape to see how these ancient Balts lived. For example, here in Estonia, we see Lake Kahala, which is clearly the point of interest for these ancient people. From the top of the hill fort, this lake looks rather far away, but it hasn't always been.
Now, you can't really see it anymore because the swamps have expanded, and trust me, I've got far too many flies crawling on me to not notice that. But these used to face towards the lake.
So the lake was clearly important to these ancient people, which isn't surprising. As a source of fresh water and an area of abundant resources, we'd expect to see some sort of spiritual connection to it. There is no writing from this time, so it's not certain in what way the lake fit into the culture of the people who lived here, but it is clear that it was important. It's not just Estonia or the lakes either.
This river used to be much wider when people first came here almost 10,000 years ago. And this swamp also used to be much larger and went right up to the base of the hill fort.
This shows something of the ancient culture that, honestly, a lot of modern Baltic culture shares, which is a great connection to the natural world. The fact that these natural features move over thousands of years leaves us a window into the past, both from how these Bronze and Iron Age people lived and how the society evolved to change it. The people of the Baltics were able to use these rivers to travel far and wide, access the wider world, and shape their culture. Animal husbandry was far more common than planting crops as a result, because it was easier to move along the landscape. It seems that the farming of crops, predominantly wheat, began in the early to middle Bronze Age, about 1600 BCE, but then it seemed to cease for nearly a millennium. Now, it should be noted that seeds do not preserve well in Baltic soils, so this may be a bias drawn from a lack of evidence. Still, it seems clear that crops were not quite as popular as livestock, and it is due to a prehistoric lifestyle that worked with the land rather than commanded it. These rivers were wide and well-traveled, and in the Roman era, the Baltic Iron Age, the region became known for its amber, becoming a prestige good to high-class Romans. Amber and the northern frontiers were synonymous in the Roman world.
Of course, these types of freshwater resources also posed a barrier. That's why Kernavė is home to the Baltic's earliest paved road, built of logs, constructed at least around the Iron Age.
The presence of these paved roads is important because they speak to a people who wanted to travel and trade, and they found ways over these swampy areas when they needed to. The amber trade was predominantly over land, not by sea. People also needed to communicate with other villages and tribes unable to live in isolation, meaning that the prehistoric Balts couldn't stick to natural pathways alone. Some roads were hidden, known only to locals in the case of invasion, but some roads were publicly known and well-traveled, used for these merchants to come and go as they pleased. And the region developed along with the rest of Europe.
See, the swamp used to extend all over this flat terrain, but over the millennia it receded, and now it's way over there.
We can see the flat plain from the modern river to the hills, showing just how far the medieval village would have expanded. It would have looked something like this, which the site has reconstructed to give the visitors an idea of what it looked like. It's also got some Iron Age dwellings too. But the whole time, the river and the natural world remained central to Kernavė's development, and Kernavė, in turn, remained central to Lithuania's development.
Because during the periods Kernavė was most in use, Lithuania was pagan and largely rural. It was only after it converted to Catholicism that Kernavė became a small rural town. and the major Grand Dukes of Lithuania, the ones who were truly lords of Catholic nations, they moved down the road to Trakai.
Trakai is a rather impressive castle sitting on a stunning lake that represents Lithuania's shift to Catholicism and into the historical records. However, that's not really the topic of this video. But of course it's not fair to portray all Baltic prehistoric populations as one group. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania all have very different cultures and follow different paths, clumped together as one cultural block by outsiders looking in rather than by the people of the region. It's also not fair to think of them all as hill-dwelling hunter-gatherers. After all, they had exposure to the wider world, and as their world grew, so did their populations and cities. Agriculture did pick up again in earnest during the Iron Age. Huge fortresses and cities were built, and in fact they even participated in Viking raids.
Now, the Baltics probably aren't the first country you think of when you think of Vikings, but nevertheless, they were as much a part of the Viking world as the Norse were in Scandinavia.
Now, to be honest, this is where my script wanted to segue into some other sites, particularly Latvia, which, don't worry, I haven't forgotten about. But this video is already running fairly long, so what I'm going to do is, to make up for the long wait for the video this time, release part 2 of this video in exactly 2 weeks, continuing the story of Baltic development and discussing how they entered the medieval world. To be honest, I prefer it this way, and I think you guys will too. After all, this has allowed me to go into much more analysis on some pretty interesting sites in an obscure region. One that hopefully you'll be able to see for yourself one day.
Oh yeah, and one more tip. Do check the bus schedules. Only an hour walk to the next town. Yeah. Anyway, there's some other videos right there. Like and subscribe, and until next time, I'm the Archaeologist, and this has been The Travels.